And thank you, Dawn, for the reminder, because I would have forgotten. So, all right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Welcome to our session today, an introduction to cultural perspectives with Indigenous Perspective Society. My name is Susana Guardado, and I'm the Senior Manager of Education here at the BC Nonprofit Housing Association. Before we start, I would like to have the opportunity to acknowledge the territory that we're in. I want to acknowledge that BCNPHA's office is currently on the home of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. And I'm currently on unceded Coast Salish traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. For me, it's important to acknowledge territory because I think it's a way of acknowledging the history that occurred here. And when I mean the history, it's a way of acknowledging the colonialist history that occurred here, but also the rich traditional history of the original peoples of this area. Personally, for me, it's also important because I'm not originally from these territories. I'm actually originally from the unceded territories of the Pipil and Lenca people in what is now known as El Salvador in Central America. And I had to leave my country because there was a civil war. And I was able to come to Canada because it offered us a place where we had peace and quality of life. But at that point, I didn't know about the violent colonial history here. So I know that part of my role as a settler here is to be able to understand and learn what my role is now in creating our present and our future as well. So, you know, and if you want to also acknowledge, some people have also acknowledged where they're from, and welcome to do that in the chat. And I know that I'm really grateful to be able to be here in this territory. Before I introduce our speakers, I also want to, of course, thank our education partners without whom this could not be possible. We have some wonderful supporters that are able to let us have these online learning events and that we can invite and make it affordable for our members. So thank you to everyone. And also, it wouldn't be a BCNPHA session if I didn't put a plug in for our conference, which this year will also be a virtual conference. So save the date, November 15th to 17th. We have a great lineup for you, and registration will be opening up in September, but I know that we have a wonderful lineup for you. And without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Rachelle Delaire and Liz Brooks, both from Indigenous Perspective Societies. Liz and Rachelle, welcome to the BCNPHA family and community. We are so thrilled to be able to have you with us and for you to be able to share what you're going to be sharing with us today. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to you. Oh, sorry, before that, I'll just say, if anyone has any issues with anything tech related with Zoom, feel free to reach out to myself, to Jackson or Tanya. You'll find us at the top of your participant list. You can chat with us. If you have any issues, just call out for us for support, and we'll be here in the background supporting everyone. So Rachelle and Liz, welcome. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, Susanna. Anin, Indigenous, Rachelle, Enemy Cog, Nanonjaba, Motanya, Nishnebeka. Hello, everybody. My name is Rachelle Delaire. My people are the Montagnais people, but I'm from the lower part of Quebec. Raised at Temagami First Nation, though. That's in Northern Ontario. I spent a lot of time in the traditional territory of the Six Nations people, also in Ontario, and then moved from the Dish with One Spoon Treaty territory, now known as Toronto, to the very beautiful territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt Nation. I'm a very honored guest, very blessed, very grateful, and very cognizant that were it not for the displacement of the First Peoples in this territory, that we might not be able to gather in this room today. So very, very cognizant. Before I launch in a little bit more, I do want to provide an opportunity for my colleague and good friend, Liz Brooks, to please introduce herself, and then we can jump into a little bit more today. Liz.
Thank you, Rachelle. Good morning, everybody. I am Liz from the Tahltan Nation of Telegraph Creek, BC, which is right up by the Alaskan border, still in BC. And I am also Chinese on my father's side, and I'm mixed British and French on my mom's side. And I've lived around BC my whole life. I've moved around quite a bit, but grew up mostly on Vancouver Island on Coast Salish territories. And for the last 7 years, I've settled in the Lekwungen territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, which is colonially known as Victoria, BC. So quite a few of you look like you're from this territory as well. I will not be delivering today, but I am here to help and do some technical support for Rochelle and play some videos. And yeah, if any of you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Liz, and thank you for your support. Really acknowledging Liz, who generally delivers with me, but like she said, is not delivering with me today. And I often find that a lot of the words and a lot of the thoughts that I'm having are as a result of the conversations and the deliveries that Liz and I have done together, but also that Liz is also a curriculum writer behind the scenes. So multi-talented, and no, she is not looking for employment. I am the executive director with the Indigenous Perspective Society. I've been with the organization for about 11 years or so. The work that we do at Indigenous Perspective Society is very close to my heart, both on a personal level and a professional level. I identify as an intergenerational survivor, and I often share stories throughout our time together. But I'm going to begin by just giving you a little bit of an overview. This is going to be just shy of about an hour and a half. This is an introductory session that provides you with simply just that. It's an overview of colonization, colonial history in Canada from first contact to the social impact of residential schools in the lives of Indigenous people. So what we're hoping that some of our outcomes are going to be is that, first of all, we're going to develop the really clear understanding of residential school history. We're going to understand the continued impacts of colonization when we're working with whether it's Indigenous children, youth, or families. And what we're also hoping to do is better understand the intergenerational impacts from the loss of traditional culture and experience as experienced by Indigenous peoples. I'm often also going to pause and talk a little bit about terminology. Language and terminology is really, really important. When we think about language and terminology, it's historically been used to marginalize and exploit Indigenous peoples. So language is very big for me, but when it comes to language and terminology, I always think it's also incredibly important to ensure that we have a common understanding of some terminology. So I want to go back, just take a step back to intergenerational impacts. And you're going to hear me talk a lot about that, and also in the subsequent sessions to come that are going to be hosted in partnership with the BC Nonprofit Housing Association. But when we talk about intergenerational impacts, I'm talking about that residual stuff. I'm talking about the residual stuff that gets passed down through families and through experiences. And we're going to come back to that in just a moment and talk about how trauma plays into that. In our time today, I want you to envision your place and role in the current state of a colonial society. And this work can sometimes be daunting. It can also be very triggering, sometimes acknowledging what we don't know. And facing that can sometimes be very difficult. So if nothing else, I honor each and every one of you for being in this room and for having that appetite. I want to further acknowledge not only the incredible diversity that's in this room, but also the incredible diversity amongst Indigenous nations across Turtle Island. And when I refer to Turtle Island, what I'm referring to is North America. Each nation and community has their own unique traditions, their languages, protocols, and stories that are passed through generations. So when we're working with, or when we're in discussions with Indigenous communities, it's really important that we're aware that there's this significant difference across nations, right? And we can't put a pan-Indigenous lens on beliefs and cultures or methods of decolonization. What we can do, though, however, is we can build our own understanding of our shared history. And sometimes we can even acknowledge some similarity across nations that may have come from those communities working together over time to create some shared experiences, etc. Today, this particular training is going to be presenting you with that general overview of those historical events and concepts. If you want to dive deeper into any of the topics discussed, there's going to be more training presented by Indigenous Perspective Society, like I said, hosted through the BC Nonprofit Housing Association. Today's session is going to touch on some pretty heavy topics and discussions regarding residential schools and colonial history. I'm going to guess that each of us probably have some very unique life experiences, and we process information in different ways. So what I'm going to really encourage you to do is I'm going to encourage you to really practice your self-care as needed and as only you know best. So this is the first thing we're going to do, friends and guests, relations. I have a poll that I'd like to put out to you, and I call it the knowledge assessment poll. And essentially I'm asking you a question based on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 to 10, based on what you know. How confident do you feel navigating intercultural relationships? So you're going to select your answer. I can see how many individuals have responded. What I can't see is how individual people respond. So I can't see your answer. So we're just going to give folks a moment to respond. We have about 50% of people who've responded. So just letting people take an opportunity to reflect on that. And the really interesting thing is that there's no right and there's no wrong answer. This is the really neat thing. We all have different experiences and exposure to education and Indigenous cultures, right? We're all on our own journey, and wherever it is that we are on our journey is where we need to be. And I really encourage you to remember that the fact that you're attending today's session means that you care about learning more. I'm seeing that there's still a handful of folks who haven't responded, so I'm going to give just another moment or two just to see if other folks want to weigh in a little bit there. This is a really neat teaching technique. I often use it when we do a full day of cultural perspectives training. And at the end of the day, I re-administer this poll. And it's really neat what happens. Sometimes people, their confidence level changes. They creep up a little bit. They say, wow, you know, I learned so much. I feel so much more confident. Sometimes people say, Rochelle, it was really interesting and fun to spend time with you. Nothing's really changed. So nothing changes. And then sometimes something else happens, which is kind of cool, but it's that they go the other way, because sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And sometimes the more we know, the more we realize we don't know. And that can impact our confidence a little bit. Liz, if I could get you to end the poll and just share those results, our friends in the room are going to see that we had some really diversified responses there. We had handfuls of people who say that I'm new to my journey. I'm not so confident. Maybe I don't feel I know as much as I could. And then you have folks who feel as though they have a little bit more confidence. Perhaps they have some transferable skills, but perhaps they've had opportunities for more immersion. And then I'm just going to close that. What I really encourage you to do is that I encourage you to just to sit without judgment of yourself in this particular exercise, but also use it for your own information. There's some additional terms, so thank you all for participating in that. That's appreciated. There's also some terms that are going to be reoccurring, not just throughout today's session, but if you join us in future sessions. So I want to talk about those terms so that when you hear me use some language, you have a clearer understanding of what it is that Rochelle is intending. So one of the words that you're going to hear me use a lot is you're going to hear me use the word ally. So when I use the word ally, I'm talking about an alliance. I'm talking about individuals who make room for marginalized voices and interests, right? It's allies that create systemic change. So when you hear Rochelle saying ally, just, okay, Rochelle is talking about the group of individuals that create space for marginalized voices. Allies generally use their own privilege to infiltrate places of privilege. Privilege is going to be a word that I'm going to use a lot today. And when you hear me using the word privilege, think about an immunity. Think about the advantages. Think about the special rights that are conferred and available only to a particular group. And I'll tell you something interesting about privilege is that it's generally almost always at the expense of somebody else. So that's privilege. You're going to hear me talk about colonization a lot. A word that we use, and it's really interesting sometimes to stop, pause, and break that language down. When you hear me talk about colonization, what I'm specifically referring to is I'm referring to three components of that make up colonization. Settlement on foreign lands, by force, and includes cultural genocide. So when you hear me refer to colonization, know that that's what I'm referring to. You're also going to hear me mention decolonization, which, I mean, one would think is just the undoing of colonization. And that is essentially what decolonization is. It's that undoing of everything that colonization means, but it's about resurgence. It's about reclaiming. And we're going to be able to talk a little bit more about that language as we go through the different training sessions, if you have the opportunity to attend future ones. So the first thing we want to do again is just make certain that individuals, friends in the room have a good understanding of those key terms before we move into the next session, because the next section is going to be a really big part of our work together. I'm taking a pause for a moment, allowing people to put their feet on the ground, figuratively and literally, because we're going to move and we're going to talk a little bit about assimilation, and we're going to talk about the legacy of colonization through residential schools. And it's really interesting for me to do this work in this way, because normally we do an entire day on this, but I do think that people taking this hour and a half out of their very, very busy schedules in order to begin the conversation is really noteworthy. When we begin talking about residential schools and colonization, residential schools especially, there's a preamble that I think is really important to do. And that preamble is that if you know about residential schools, you're going to know that it was a policy, that it was enacted by the federal government, and that it was administered by the churches. And if you've heard stories, and if you know of residential schools, you're also going to know that some pretty significant atrocities happened in school. Our babies lost their lives. Many of them lost their lives. My father attended residential school in Northern Ontario. He was one of them who came home. Perhaps he's considered one of the lucky ones. We know that our kids and our relations suffered sexual abuse, physical abuse, corporal punishment. They were starved. They were used as guinea pigs with vitamins. They were held from their families. They weren't allowed to go home. So sometimes when we are affiliated with a particular denomination or a particular congregation, and we hear those stories, as individuals, we start to take that on. And what I often do is I tell friends in the room that you have to be really, really careful to be able to separate yourself. Shared history means shared responsibility. Yes, we have a responsibility to educate ourselves so that we better understand what our role is and how we're complicit in colonial society. However, it's really important to remember that we were not the individuals sitting in that room committing those atrocities against children. So, like I said, if you're affiliated with a particular congregation or a particular church, to remember that when we carry enough shame, that's going to have a very negative effect, and that negative effect usually gets us stuck. And so we want to prevent that from happening. The purpose of this topic today, what I want to do is really just provide an overview that the role that residential schooling played in the lives of Indigenous people. And what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to provide a little bit of insight into those intergenerational impacts. So again, that's stuff that kind of hangs on. I always find it really difficult to not say what I'm about to say next, because I think it's really difficult to talk about residential schools and to better understand how colonialism has impacted Indigenous communities without talking about trauma-informed practice and different types of trauma. So I encourage you to look at trauma this way. There are three types of trauma. There is acute trauma, there's chronic trauma, and then there's complex trauma. Your acute trauma is kind of like one incident, one time. So sometimes a car accident might be described as a form of acute trauma. You have chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is one incident, one type of incident, but over and over and over and over again over an extended period of time. That's generally an example of that. Family violence is often considered a form of chronic trauma. And then you have complex trauma. And complex trauma is a whole bunch of different types of trauma over a very, very, very long period of time. And complex trauma is what we're seeing in Indigenous communities. Complex trauma is very tricky as well. It gets called other things sometimes. Sometimes complex trauma gets called alcoholism. Sometimes it gets called mental health. Sometimes it gets called poverty. Sometimes it gets called violence. But in Indigenous communities, sometimes when you peel back those layers of those labels, what you see underneath is you see complex trauma, often passed through generation, generation, and generation. It's a body of work that, like I said, is very close to my heart. I've put a lot of time and work into better understanding it, so that I can better understand my own life, so I can better understand the lives of those who came before me, my families, my father. I can tell you something though, another little bit of a preamble and perhaps a caution is that sometimes when we've experienced our own trauma, we're going to watch a very short video coming up in just a moment. And sometimes when we listen to other people's trauma, when we have our own that isn't quite healed, it can wake that up inside of us. So we want to be really aware of that. We want to be able to anticipate it, and we want to be able to care for ourselves in ways that are going to be able to be supportive to our learning. So just a caution there. I'm going to introduce the history of residential schools and the large part that they played in Canadian history with the displacement of Indigenous peoples and communities. I have a very short video I'd like to play for you here. And again, reminding you to care for yourself well, to feet on the ground, and always a very, very gentle and loving reminder that it is scientifically proven that the body cannot hold on to stress when you breathe. So always using your breath if you're coming up and hearing and seeing information that feels very difficult. Liz, if I could get you to show that, please.
My name is Clifford Quaw. I am from the Tlaitli First Nations. I'm also an elder and a residential school survivor. And I attended the Lejac Indian Residential School, located 200 kilometers west of Prince George.
My name is Cora Voyageur. I'm a survivor of the Holy Angels Residential School in Fort Chipewyan, Alberta.
My name is Rose Grace Miller. I am survivor of the Kamloops Indian Residential School in Kamloops.
I was 5 years old when I was forcibly taken.
I was 9 years old when I was taken.
I was only 8 years old at the time. We were loaded onto a cattle truck in 1949 and brought to the residential school. My two brothers and myself.
I was in residential school with my two younger sisters, Lillian and Dorothy.
At this school, I experienced emotional, physical, mental, and sexual abuse. And the trauma was so great that I blanked most of my school days at Lejac.
The violence that we experienced at the hands of the nuns was quite random. So it was like you were walking on eggshells and didn't really know, what was going to happen next.
And it was horrible to be there. They told us if we didn't pray, the devil would take us to hell and burn us. They said if we didn't pray, the Romans would come and they would drape us and they would burn our eyes and burn our hands and poke out our eyes. 8 years old, you believe whatever you're told. So we pray all the harder.
When I was in residential school, there was one instance that I experienced where my sister was being beaten by a nun on the other side of a door. And my sister was screaming and crying. And I was on the other side of the door trying to get in and trying to basically rescue her from a nun who seemed to be quite out of control. It was terrifying to have someone that you love being beaten and really not being able to do anything about it.
Many times we got knocked to the floor by the nuns, and they would call us a whore. We don't even know what a whore is. I was raped there at Indian school. For me, it followed me through my life. The anger, the fear, the shame.
I was so mad and angry and everything. All my life was big negativity. All my positive attitudes I buried.
My reaction to the news out of Kamloops from last week was, of course, great sadness and sympathy for the families of those children who never did come back from residential school. But I wasn't surprised by it. I don't for a minute believe that this is the only one in Canada.
I, as a survivor, expected this. But what really shocked me was I thought there'd be 10 10 or 20. But when they said 215, you expected to find that somewhere else but in Canada. That was mind-boggling.
We knew that there was missing children. We knew there was children that were buried on the hillside there and probably on the school. We knew there was people burned in an incinerator just below our rec room.
It could have very easily have been me or one of my sisters.
It could have been my brothers. It could have been me. Couldn't have ran away. I could have drowned in a river. I was only 8 years old.
I want non-Indigenous people to know that there is a very dark history in Canada and that people have to be understanding and they have to be compassionate.
I want the non-Indigenous people to know that how painful it was and how the colonization hurt us so badly, how it's still hurting us with the racism.
I want the non-Indigenous people to understand. They must know, they must learn more about the schools. And that's the reason, one of the reasons why I'm doing this, to educate the public about what happened in the residential schools and how I went through about 20 years of my life to where I am today.
They need to understand and stand beside us. It's not their fault. I'm not bringing this up to blame anybody, but I want the history to be known.
Thank you, Liz. Those are really hard stories to listen to. They're words that are hard to hear. They're stories that are very sadly not unique in our communities. And at the time of this video, the 215 babies had just been found in Kamloops. And now those numbers are over 1,500. And very, very sadly, the knowledge keepers and the wise ones in our communities tell us that there's a lot more to come. Communities and families, individuals have dealt with the history in Indigenous communities in a lot of different ways. One of the ways is they've chosen not to talk about it. We choose as a society to empower our people by talking about it, and we choose to empower non-Indigenous allies by helping them understand sometimes some of the things they see and maybe some of the things that they've heard. We have a special friend in our circle who says that when he was at the peak of his pain, he would often drink very, 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 very heavily and did so for decades to drown out the sounds of crying, to drown out some of the visuals that he has that he had and continues to have in his head. And these are really powerful realities that exist. Even though our shared history is really unsettling and really cruel, it's important though that individuals don't take on the shame or the guilt from that history. The role of an ally, your role in this room, is to learn about that shared history and to know the dynamics of privilege and how it comes into play with how it is that we walk through the world. You have the opportunity to use that privilege to decolonize your spaces. And it's not about feeling shame or feeling bad about having privilege, right? It's about what we do with that privilege and what we do with it to work alongside Indigenous peoples and communities towards decolonization, right? Learning about this history, this is just the first step. It's an important step. I'm going to talk about a decolonization toolkit that you may or may not want to use. And that's going to give you a little bit of direction on how it is that you can participate in decolonization, but learning about the history is kind of one of the first steps. Throughout the months of June and July in Canada, we saw a lot of non-Indigenous people really accepting colonial history and the unfair treatment, the cruel treatment of Indigenous peoples. Some of us are hearing about it for the first time. And as more residential schools are searched, and more children are being found, there's this huge collective awakening occurring, right? And we're seeing more people who are willing and wanting to do the work. In order for us to work towards allyship and progress, what's essential is that we have an understanding of our shared history and the platform that we're working on. I have a resource I'd like to share with you. It's a residential school map across Canada. I'm going to get Liz to just put that on the screen. If this is something, a visual that you're interested in, I'm happy to share this with you. I know that that's a little bit difficult to see unless you have much better eyesight than I do, but I think that what I intend with this particular visual is really just to demonstrate how pervasive the system of schooling was. I often have individuals say, I had no idea there were so many. There are actually more than this, because this particular visual that you're looking at only includes schools that were involved in the settlement process. So the settlement process was whereby schools engaged in financial compensation to the students they harmed. There are schools that are on here. There are schools that are not on here. There are privately run schools that aren't pictured here. But if nothing else, what it does do is it provides you that visual of these schools weren't a couple of schools here and there. This was a pervasive system. There were schools littered across Canada. And I did notice that in the chat, somebody was looking for a source for this particular resource, and I'm going to get Liz to provide that, if not in this moment, perhaps before we complete our time today. If not, we'll send it out afterwards as well, and it can go out. I'm leaving that on for just another moment. Thank you for that, Liz. You know, information about residential school was always systematically withheld. I was surprised at one time, and I learned very quickly. I was surprised at one time delivering training, and I did 4 or 5 rounds of 50 people each, so trained a fairly large group. And I would say about 90 to 95% of that group said that their knowledge of residential schools was very, very limited, or they had none. Over the years, while I've been delivering training, I have come to realize, and I have come to accept, that residential information about residential school was systematically withheld by the educational system. Very, very intentional. And it really wasn't until the 1990s, maybe the 1980s, that stories began to be shared. Yeah, and like I said, that map that only includes the schools that were involved in the settlement process, just remain cognizant of how many more schools there were. That schools housed sometimes hundreds of students at once, and were in operation for decades and decades and decades and decades. There is a statistic that is quite public. Around more than 150,000 children attended residential schools. And the information that I have in my communities and from my knowledge keepers is that that number is highly, highly understated. I often get asked as well, you know, when all of these atrocities were happening in residential schools, where were the other Canadian families? Like, where were they when this is happening? Because there are good people who would never have allowed this to happen. And the truth is that the general population of Canada were getting very, very different messages about what it was that was going on in Indigenous residential schools. And I want to show you a really quick clip. It's only 2 minutes long. It's very short. But I'd like you to make some observations of what it is that you see in this video. And Liz and I call this the propaganda video.
South of Hudson's Bay, James Bay, and at the southern tip of James Bay, the settlement of Moose Factory. News Magazine salutes Education Week with films of an Indian residential school 500 miles north of Toronto. Eric Barrington dispenses first aid among his many other duties. He heads one of Canada's 69 Indian residential schools, scattered in key locations as far north as the Arctic Circle. They've a total of 11,000 pupils, orphans, convalescents, those who live too far in the wilderness to get to a daily school. They learn not only games and traditions, such as the celebration of St. Valentine's Day, but the mastery of words, which will open to them the whole range of the ordinary Canadian curriculum. For children who live with the midnight sun in their summer holidays, an explanation. They come to school in September, go home for holidays in June. Instead of the isolation and neglect of the past, a free and equal chance with children in urban centers. A service begins each day. The school is conducted by the Church of England, though it's maintained, like other Indian schools, by the Federal Department of Indian Affairs. For the oldest Canadians, a new future.
Thank you again for that, Liz. So for those of you who are either observing the recording or perhaps sitting in this room today, I'm wondering if you could just pause for a moment, make some reflections. You're welcome to use the chat function. Anybody reviewing the recording afterwards, I believe will have access to any comments recorded into the chat. But if you could use the chat function, please, just to share some of your observations and what you saw when you looked at that short video, that short clip. There's a lot of stuff that came up for me in there. And it's funny sometimes, for as many times as I've watched the propaganda video, I often see new stuff all the time. Yeah, didn't they make it sound like this lovely place? Very, very staged is one of the things that I observed. Did anybody observe or take notice of the music? The music is always very jarring to me, because I consider the first video that we saw, I think of the stories that I have of my father's history and the stories that we hear from our elders here in the community and good friends that walk in a circle with Liz and I. And it's in stark contrast to what this is. That music often makes me think of Disney. It reminds me of Saturday morning cartoons. So it kind of puts that feel good, leaves you with this, that feel good feeling. Thank you to those of you who are contributing through the chat of what your observations were. I don't know if anybody caught this, but did anybody catch in the bottom corner, there's a little emblem that said CBC, not intended to be a political statement at all. But CBC is often seen as a trustworthy source. And so if CBC is providing that information, families were likely to have believed it. And thank you, please continue to put your observations in the chat function. And I think that this might have been mentioned already, but remember I was saying that language is really big to me. And so there's language in there that is very, very problematic. Orphans, convalescence. And we know that our children, our babies weren't orphaned. They were taken forcibly and families were threatened to be arrested if they tried to prevent their babies from being taken. The kids were isolated, that they were neglected, which is the farthest from the truth. In fact, stories that we hear, but we have one elder in our circles who has moved back out to Enoch, where he's from, but he talks about his grandfather hiding him in the mountains so that when they came through the village, they wouldn't find him. Our kids weren't isolated, they weren't neglected, and they were by far not orphans. I also, yeah, hockey, very, very Canadianized, the hockey and the ping pong. I find it particularly problematic when I hear the language free and equal chance, because when we're watching the news and when we hear the stories in our communities and from our relations, we know that there was nothing free about it and there was nothing equal about it. There was other language around the mastery of words, access to ordinary Canadian curriculum. And really, to me, what I heard and what I see is an undermining of traditional education, but it's also almost like a demonization of Indigenous child rearing practices and how that was done in Indigenous communities. I had somebody say to me quite recently too, and I hadn't caught this, but they said that when they were observing this propaganda video with me, that they talk about it being implemented by the Department of Indian Affairs, and that for anybody who doesn't know the function of that department would think, hey, that's Indigenous people who are overseeing this. That's a good thing, right? That they know what their kids are doing and where their kids are. And so what a lot of folks probably didn't realize, much like this individual who was talking, I think with Liz and I, was saying that if somebody says Department of Indian Affairs administers this policy, I would think that that would be a safety net, when in fact, the Department of Indian Affairs was a colonial system, right? And I believe that the language that was used in information that went around government was to take the Indian, or to kill the Indian in the child, to take the Indian out of the child and to kill the Indian in the child. Really problematic, but what it does do is it gives us a sense of where the rest of Canadian families were when this was all happening, because for some of us, we're really deeply troubled when it's kind of like, how could I have not known? How could I not have known? Because of historical events like residential schools, the 60s scoop, and if you're not familiar with the 60s scoop, residential schools was a policy enacted by the federal government. When they rescinded that policy, there was a practice of removing kids at alarmingly rapid rates, Indigenous kids, and adopting them into non-Indigenous homes, taking them out of their culture. That was the 60s scoop. So I was a 60s scoop baby. So because of historical events like residential school, the 60s scoop, the stealing of the land, and what was shown in the videos, it's created this continuous rippling effect that still really strongly impacts Indigenous communities today. And so when we talk about the legacy of colonization, that's the stuff that we're talking about. And you know, somebody, when they walked in, they were talking about stolen lands. And Susanna said, you know, we're going to make reference to that. And stolen lands is really big. It's a really, really big conversation, probably well beyond the scope of our time here today. But when you think of taking of the land, think of it like this. The land is medicine to Indigenous peoples. When you take the land, you're taking something that is preventing Indigenous people from healing themselves in the way that they know best. When we think of colonization, a conversation that we often have in our circles is that think of it as a pebble or a boulder, because a pebble just really feels like it minimizes what colonization is, but think of a pebble or a boulder and think about throwing it into the middle of a pond or an ocean. We have a good friend who often uses this metaphor. No matter the size of the stone or no matter the size of the body of water, no matter where we are within that water, either right where that stone touches or the edges of the shoreline, wherever it is we are, we all feel the effects of the stone in one way or another, right? We're all impacted in different ways, whether we're Indigenous, whether we're not Indigenous. We all have this unique responsibility and role to play when it comes to decolonization. So it's important, first of all, to understand colonization. Also very important to understand decolonization, because regardless of who we are, it impacts our ability to have effective relationships with each other. So we all have this responsibility that we play. When we hear people sometimes discuss colonialism, I sometimes feel and I sometimes hear them speak in a way that makes it feel like colonization was and colonialism was this thing way in the past. The past, though, are like these series of different chapters of a lifelong story. And there's a lot of forms of colonization still today. And if we were in person, one of the things we do right about now is we break out into tiny, tiny groups, and we would talk about identifying those current forms, current examples of colonization, so that we better understand this isn't something that happened years and years ago. This is stuff that's happening today. And yes, one of those, and I think I just saw it in the chat function, but one of those is the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the justice system. There's an overrepresentation of our babies still in the child welfare system. Our babies in the child welfare system are most likely to come into care. They're also most likely to remain in care. They're most likely to age out of care. They're least likely to experience permanency in the form of adoption. Overrepresentation of our babies in the child welfare system is one of those current examples. The Indian Act is a current example. Status cards is an example where the government determines if you are Indigenous enough to hold a card. And if you're Indigenous enough to hold a card, your identity will expire after a period of time, and you've got to try again and make certain that you're still Indigenous. Some very, very colonial systems, Boyle Advisories in Indigenous communities. Last I checked, I believe, I used to be able to find it on the First Nations Health Authority website, but more than 100 communities, Indigenous communities with Boyle Advisories, where somebody can't turn on a tap and take a glass of water to drink. Funding disparities. If you're not familiar with Cindy Blackstock and her Human Rights Tribunal, very, very interesting work and what she was able to achieve on behalf of our communities when it came to funding disparities. She successfully sued the federal government for funding Indigenous communities less than mainstream communities when it came to children. Healthcare. I have a colleague in the community who I've crossed paths with, and I often hear him say that our little girls, our young women are starting families of their own, and they're pregnant. And because of their fear of the child welfare system, because of their fear of the racism and discrimination that they're going to experience in the healthcare system, they are not going to the doctors and caring for their bodies as well as caring for their unborn child because they're scared, they're frightened. These are current forms of colonization that are happening today. Colonization is not a historical set of events. It is very, very current. And sometimes when we see things in Indigenous communities and we are tempted to label them, and we're tempted to label them substance abuse or substance misuse or mental health, we're tempted to label them in all these ways, when we better understand historical forms of oppression as well as current forms of oppression, we're able to make connections and better understand what it is that we see in communities. A lot of very big discussions. I can appreciate that we're not going to be able to go in the depth that perhaps that we want today, but we're going to find opportunities to be able to continue to have these discussions. And I hope that you're able to join us at later times. I want to emphasize as we proceed that it's also really important that these examples and the cause of them, that we recognize those as intentional. They're systematic, and they continue to impact and affect Indigenous peoples every day. So in order to do a good job, in order to do good work, it's really important that we do our own self-reflection to identify our strengths in areas where our own cultural beliefs or privilege might be limiting our ability to be effective allies, right? And so we call that cultural intelligence. And cultural intelligence fascinates me. And I describe cultural intelligence as sort of having three components. It has a cognitive component, it has a physical component, and it has an emotional component that is sometimes called a motivational component. So when you think of cultural intelligence, think of it this way. In order to build your cultural intelligence, you need cultural knowledge. So cultural knowledge is kind of like that cognitive piece. It's kind of what you know. You get it in a whole bunch of different ways. Sometimes it's very experiential. Yes, that's true. Sometimes you'll read an article, you'll read a book, you'll see a movie. Maybe you'll sit in a training such as this one or a seminar. Maybe you'll be having a discussion with somebody, but you build your knowledge. It's what you know. But cultural intelligence takes more than cultural knowledge. What you also need is you need to refine and you need to be able to effectively execute your cross-cultural relational skills, I call them. And I know it's a lot of language, but your cross-cultural relational skills. The really neat thing about cross-cultural relational skills is that you're going to build them a lot faster if you've already got your cultural knowledge base. It kind of works that way. Cross-cultural skills are really cool because cross-cultural skills you only build by doing. So you actually got to go out and do. And sometimes there's oopses, and sometimes it's painful. Sometimes we have to apologize, and sometimes the learning is a little bit difficult, but it's important. It's really, really critical. And so your cross-cultural relational skills is everything from like, it's like your tolerance for uncertainty. The greater the tolerance, the better, the more effective you are. It's your empathy, right? That's your ability to be able to see and feel the world through somebody else's eyes. It's your adaptability. It's your ability to relate to other people. It's about perceptual acuities. And when I describe perceptual acuities, I describe it as perceptual acuities are kind of like spotting anomalies in social situations and being able to respond accordingly. And just knowing that I don't understand that, I don't recognize that, I don't know what that's a cultural protocol, and being able to stay with it and be comfortable with it. I always use this one example. It's my favorite example, and I have to share it. It's one of my favorite stories. There is a colleague, for those of us who live in Victoria, and he works at UVic now, Dr. Musa Magasa, a very, very beautiful human being. And if you've never heard him speak, you absolutely must hear him speak. And so when Musa Magasa walks into your house sometimes, he shakes your elbow. And this is really neat because in Western society, we shake hands. The first time that I was witness to this, I was caught off guard, and you have this like quick little mental checklist that goes through what's happening. Is he trying to, is he making fun of me? Is he trying to make me laugh? And then you realize, hold on a sec, cultural protocol, I don't understand it. That's okay. And you shake Musa's elbow. Musa is from an African tribe, and he says that in his community and in his village, you shake elbows because when you shake elbows, you're holding each other up. It's I hold you up, neighbor. Perceptual acuity, to be able to recognize that. Another really cool example specific to Indigenous communities. Have you ever found in Indigenous communities that sometimes Indigenous peoples don't make eye contact as much, or they make little eye contact? And our kids are often taught that when you want to demonstrate respect, especially when there's elders in the room, or if you're demonstrating humility, you will often lower your eyes. When I first started my position with the Indigenous Perspective Society, one of my portfolios was HR, and we had a third-party service provider, and they had this check sheet, which is kind of neat. So if you do this, give this some thought. But this check sheet was like, if this, so people would come in for an interview, and it said, this particular candidate does this, ooh, they get a check mark. And if they do this, they'll also get a check mark. And if they do this, and there's a list, and then you basically add up all the points, and whoever's got the most points is deemed to be the most suitable candidate. Well, very interestingly, is one of those things on that checklist was eye contact. So the moment I had an Indigenous candidate being interviewed, they were automatically put at a disadvantage if they had been taught that to lower your eyes is about demonstrating respect and demonstrating humility. I've also been told as well in the community by some of our elders that if you made eye contact with the priests and the nuns in residential schools, you were beaten quite severely. So for some of our older generations, it's very embedded in them. So that's a part of that too. Perceptual acuities. I told you I was passionate about cultural intelligence. There's a third component. So the cultural knowledge, that's sort of like that cognitive piece, and then your cross-cultural skills is that physical piece, but then you have that emotional and motivational piece. And what that is I call it cultural metacognition. And I won't test you on this, but very simply, your cultural metacognitions is your ability to think about the way that you think. So to think about the way that you think. Where did I learn to think like that? Who taught me that? Is that a truth? Is that something I have picked up? Is that a stereotype? Do I have evidence? Does my perception shift if there's contradictory evidence in front of me? Your ability to be able to refine sort of like your cultural knowledge and your cross-cultural skills, you refine, you re-execute over and over and over again. And that is the process of cultural metacognitions. When it comes to cultural intelligence, you can take that information and you can apply it. And you can apply it in a whole lot of different ways when you're in communities. And a lot of it you're going to learn. You're going to learn as you go. And sometimes you learn by making mistakes, and that's all right. Because there's protocols, there's behaviors when it comes to showing respect in communities. And there's some very basics to build on. Those perceptual acuities, like that eye contact, that's one of them. I don't know if you're a guest sitting in our room today who has perhaps been a culprit of using colloquialisms before. Colloquialisms they're sort of like those really informal phrases we use in really familiar conversation. So it's kind of like, hey, let's all get together and have a powwow, or lowest man on the totem pole. Oh, I feel like the lowest man on the totem poles. Those colloquialisms, if you've been known to use them, I'm going to strongly, strongly recommend as one of the very basics to build on. Don't use those. Often they're a reference point that's inaccurate, highly inaccurate. Lowest man on the totem pole. I actually called the radio station last week. The announcer on 98.5 used lowest man on the totem pole. And I called the station and I said, I heard you make that reference and I think that you used it incorrectly. And so I was explaining to him that often people use that reference to demonstrate that I feel like as though I have no decision-making power. And so I'm the lowest one on the totem pole. But what's very interesting is, the totem poles that when they're built, the foundation is the strongest because that's where everything starts. So being really, really careful. If you want to learn more about protocols and behaviors and showing respect in community and those basics to build on, there's a really cool book that may sound dated, but it's absolutely not. It was written in 2007, very, very relevant, by Bob and Cynthia Joseph, Working Effectively with Aboriginal Peoples is what it's called. But that entire book is all about do's and don'ts. And in our one-day cultural perspectives training that Indigenous Perspective Society shares, and I believe that we are going to share this in one of the future sessions through the BC Nonprofit Housing Association, is we go through the do's and don'ts. But if you're super, super eager and reading is your thing, you're an avid reader, you'll want to pick up that book and you'll want to give it a read. And it gives you a lot of basics to build on. And it talks about, as an ally in Indigenous communities, when you want to show up, attend cultural events. That's part of your responsibility, show up. And it's not just about showing up for celebration, it's showing up when people are in need as well. There are a lot of very common practices and beliefs, but there's a lot of diversity within and between Indigenous peoples and communities. So some protocols, I'll give you an example, maybe such as offering tobacco. You're going to do in some communities, but you're not going to do it in other communities. But here's the really good news, friends, is you don't need to know all that. You don't need to have a list of every single one of the communities and every single one of their protocols, because some of that information isn't yours to have. However, if you're a guest in that community, there are ways in which that you can get that information. And I know that folks in the chat function are asking for the name of that book. That book is was done by Bob and Cynthia Joseph in 2007, and it's called Working Effectively with Aboriginal Peoples. So really being cognizant that, and then that other part of cultural intelligence is recognizing that, okay, I was invited to this community, I was invited to participate in this ceremony, yay. Well, we've got to remember that the same type of ceremony might be held in another community and might be done differently. So when we're using our cultural intelligence and we're being respectful of the diversity of Indigenous communities across British Columbia, or even Canada for that matter, that what we're also being very, very cognizant of is that I won't know it all. I'm not expected to know it all, but I need to be asking if I'm going to show up in a respectful way. Does that make sense? There are ways that you can seek guidance. There are ways that you can ask for mentorship in order to have these meaningful and effective relationships with Indigenous communities. And I'm hoping that through our time together that we're going to be able to explore that in a little bit more depth. You might know that a lot of cultural events are considered really sacred. So people from outside of the community sometimes are not able to participate in some ceremonies. Sometimes it's because of the spiritual nature of the ceremony, or maybe it's because of specific cultural protocol. The community is always the leader in facilitating cultural milestones for members, right? My point is to, if I can just leave you with one thing, it's just to just never homogenize. Always assume that there's a difference unless you're otherwise told, and you're generally going to do very, very well. Yeah, ceremonies and protocols take so many forms, right? Every ceremony is culturally specific to the nation and the nation that's hosting. There are a lot of very complex realities that easily make it difficult, that make it difficult to truly understand the dynamics that are constantly at play, right? It's often common, I hear a lot of people say, I feel so stuck, where to begin? I don't know what steps to take. I don't know what to do next. This person in the community told me to do one thing, and that other community told me to do another thing. And we always say, yep, that's going to happen, because that's about the diversity. Think of our own families, getting consensus in our own families. I don't know why it is that Indigenous communities are perceived as different, because that's going to happen. But do you remember I was telling you that there's a tool out there, Decolonization Toolkit, that I wanted to introduce you to? It's written by Vidya. Vidya is a nonprofit in Fernwood, and to this day, I need to drop in and say, hello, my name is Rochelle. Do you have any idea how often I talk about your resource? They have a decolonization toolkit, and it's public, it's online, you can use it. They've recently done a new one that's a decolonization toolkit for organizations. I have to just tell you that the first one, that's called just the decolonization toolkit, is still my favorite. Done really, really well and really simply. And it lays out your steps in order to do it, in order to do decolonization by doing it. What does that look like? And so the first thing they say is that when we're looking at decolonization and doing that work, the very first thing that you're required to do is you need to self-locate yourself. And so if there's any of you who are saying, self-locate yourself, Rochelle, what are you talking about? Self-location, it's sort of like, it's like these the social categories that we belong to based on gender and age and economic status, race, ethnicity. So when we self-locate, it's, so for myself, I would self-locate and I would say I'm an Indigenous woman, I'm heterosexual, I would state my economic status, I might state my education. But the interesting thing is that where that intersection of social location occurs, that's either going to confer privilege or it's going to marginalize you. And where you walk in circles of privilege, it's important to be able to recognize that and how that might impact your relationship with other people who don't experience the same privilege. Because sometimes it's really easy for us to not pay as much attention to matters or issues that don't disadvantage us because of the privilege that we walk in. Anyhow, that social location. So the first thing Vidya says in this decolonization toolkit is that if you want to inspire transformation, if you want to promote shared knowledge, if you want to promote engagement, you're going to have to do these steps. But the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to self-locate yourself. Knowing your own culture is where you start. There's a beautiful woman, if you ever want to YouTube her, her name is Julia Middleton, and all she talks about is cultural intelligence. And you know how I feel about cultural intelligence. But she says, you know, people often think that cultural intelligence is about understanding a whole lot of things about a whole bunch of other cultures, It's not. Cultural intelligence is about knowing our own culture best and how our culture fits in to the mainstream system, in this case, the colonial system. In the decolonizing toolkit, the other thing they do, the second step they tell you to do is that it's understanding history, right? It's understanding your shared history. And this is really neat. This is really cool because this is what you're doing today. You're starting it. I often I'm an Indigenous person. I'm a guest in this territory because I'm from Montreal, or from Lower Quebec, sorry, and then spent a lot of time in Ontario. So I'm a guest here, but even as an Indigenous person, I still sit in rooms and hear elders talk and other relations talk, Indigenous peoples, and I learn more and more every day. And it's interesting because it's like I told you, that our families have dealt with the trauma that they've experienced in a lot of different ways. And very, very sadly, a lot of our families chose not to talk about that. So the generations that came after that to understand what it is that they were experiencing and seeing in their own communities and in their own families. Vidya, in their Decolonization Toolkit, also says that it's not until you do the self-location, it's not until you understand, you have that overview of Indigenous history, that you can really go and engage in Indigenous communities and help elevate Indigenous voices. I think that you can do some of these simultaneously sometimes. And I know that it can be really difficult, and it takes a lot of courage to feel like you don't know enough, and then to step into Indigenous communities and say, I want to show up. I want to better understand. But think of cultural intelligence. Think of it in terms of cultural knowledge. Have I built that up? Have I done that part? And then those cross-cultural skills. Do I have a few of those? Am I aware of what those are? Really, really important. There's this like foundational work that you can do for yourself that really equips you when you go into community. Anyhow, you can go through that, and it goes on to talk about this decolonization toolkit, goes on to talk about what does reconciliation look like? What does decolonization look like? The truth and reconciliation calls to action. What's yours? So, you know, if you've ever read the report, some people say, oh my gosh, this is such a big report. That report is probably the most user-friendly report, the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action. 90 some odd, 94, 92, 94 calls to action. 94, thank you, Liz. 94 calls to action, know yours. And you know, part of decolonization and part of reconciliation is say, this is ours. That's really tangible. That is one place where you can start. This is my call to action. How am I going to make that happen? In a lot of the different industries and a lot of the different sectors, one of the commission's recommendations was educate yourself on the history of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous realities, because you can't rely on the educational system to have done that for you. You're doing it. That's one part that you can do. That's one part that you can bring into your organization. It's a really great resource. I leave that with you. That's something that you can look into. If you participate in some of our future sessions, we're going to be bringing those. You're going to get a nice little participant manual the next time that we meet. I know that we're getting closer to the end of the time, and I wasn't certain if the BC Nonprofit Housing Associated wanted to ensure that there was time left for questions, but I want to leave you with a little bit of a roadmap. And I want you to understand that there are realities of intergenerational trauma, and that they show up in a whole lot of ways. And when they do show up, those signs of trauma, just know that Indigenous peoples are not defined by those. And in fact, those social conditions, those health and well-being indicators that we sometimes see in Indigenous communities around illness and poverty and mental health and substance misuse or abuse, those are not inherent to Indigenous peoples. That was taught to us or given to us, much like violence was. I was sharing with you that my father attended residential school in Northern Ontario. He passed away a couple of years ago. He was so impacted that he wasn't able to raise me. So I was raised by the child welfare system. And very interestingly, he never told the family, his family, that his children had been taken until we were about 2 years in. And by then, this very ugly court system had taken over, and we were displaced. I talked to my auntie, his sister. She didn't attend residential school, and sort of being in her embrace is considerably different than the experience that I had with my natural parents. But that is what I mean when I say intergenerational trauma, and it's not his fault. I spent a lot of years very, very angry with my father. I also blamed him for a lot of things that went wrong in my life, and some of the unlearning that I've had to do in my life. And it took me decades to realize that that actually wasn't his fault. That was done to him, and it was done to him forcibly. And when he left that system, he was left with what he was left. And he did the very best, I believe, that he could in the moment that he did it with what he had. And that takes a long time to get to. So very cognizant of that, not only in my own families, but in our communities. I want to take the opportunity to very generously thank all of you for just creating this space in this room. Also wanting to thank the BC Nonprofit Housing Association for your kindness and the safety that you set up in gearing up for our event today, but also at the beginning of today. To my good friend Liz, of course, who's always very generous and is standing very, very close by just about everywhere I go when I'm delivering training. I appreciate you, Liz. I appreciate the human that you are and the gifts that you bring. So with that, I say miigwech, all my relations. I'd like to take the opportunity to turn the microphone back over to our hostess, Susanna. And Susanna, I leave it to you to perhaps bring forward any questions that were left in the chat or to open the floor. Miigwech.
Gracias, Rachel. Thank you so much. And thank you, Liz, as well. You're a really dynamic duo and helping each other out. And I think I love to see just that role modeling of support, right? And holding each other up through that. Thank you, Rochelle, for sharing all that information, but also sharing your own personal history to be able to connect it, right? And I'm also really grateful for some of the stuff that people have been sharing in the chat, some information about their own reflection, their own family history and their own connection to this as well. And I agree with you, Rochelle, we're all learning, we're on a journey of learning, and by being here, you have indeed, taking steps towards that. So I'm really grateful for you making the time. As Rochelle mentioned, we are doing some additional workshops. So I've put the link in and you'll see all the ones are connected. Those ones have limited seating. Sorry, I live in a very loud road. Those have limited seatings and they're longer, so that you're able to really do a deeper dive into the particular topics and have some of that reflection time and conversations with everybody else. So please check them out and please register for them so that we're able to run them, of course. I know we only have about 15 minutes, but I do think if there is anyone that has a particular question or comment, Rochelle, if it's okay with you, I'd like to invite people to just kind of pose a question. And I know people have been asking as they go, but if anybody does have a question, feel free to use this opportunity to ask our speakers anything that is currently on your mind. So I'll just give that moment for the chat box and kind of go from there. And I'm already seeing people just thanking you both as well for the stories, for the information. Rashmi is feeling called to live the allies even more. And as Brenda's saying, definitely your sharing your experiences makes the session resonate and more meaningful. So thank you for that as well. And so far, no questions, but I'm still going to give some people time. It takes time to type.
Yes.
Is what I learned.
And one of the things that we always say as well, Susanna, is that Liz and I remain your friends. We remain available. So if there are questions that, as professionals, we have very high expectations of each other. We also have very high expectations of ourselves. And sometimes we have questions that feel vulnerable, we feel very vulnerable asking those questions. And so what Liz and I often say is that there are more anonymous ways that you can reach out to us, because it's important. You deserve to have those questions answered. Like I said, the educational system has not always done as well. I'm very happy to say that I walk in circles now and have sat in rooms with parts of the educational system. Things are shifting. The system is far from perfect, but things are shifting. But historically, there is information that we never got. And sometimes we feel very vulnerable in asking those questions. And if there's a more anonymous way that you want to reach out to Liz and I, that you are welcome to do that as well. We make ourselves available. And Susanna, you always, of course, have my permission to share contact information. If somebody says, Michelle, can I just reach out and can I pick your brain? Can I chat about this for a moment? Or yeah, whatever that might be.
Thank you, Rochelle. Thank you for that generous offer and invitation, because yeah, like you said, this information hasn't been made available before. So there's still a lot that we might not know and we need to ask questions, right? So thank you for that invite. And so just to let folks know, what I'm going to do is after this session is over, I'm going to compile all the wonderful resources that were shared, all the links. And I'm also going to share with you an evaluation link so that you can evaluate the session. It's really important that you do fill these out just so that we can say to our funders and our sponsors, please continue to support us to be able to offer these important learning opportunities. And we also want to hear from you if there's anything else that you would like as well, right? So I'll follow up and I'll compile compile all those sessions. And Liz, thank you. I see that you've included your emails on the chat so that people are able to have that in case they need to reach out to you. And again, people, just thanking you for your information. And again, I'll just put again a call out there if anyone has an additional comment or question. And if not, we might begin to wrap this up. And Tanya, I will also ask you if you're able to see, because I know sometimes if there's a hand up, I might not be able to see it. So if you see any hands up, let me know, Tanya, and we can go from there.
Thanks, Susanna. I see Willa has her hand up.
Hi there, thank you.
Open her camera. No problem.
Awesome.
As a Indigenous person and working in as a professional in the helping industry, it has been really challenging as a Indigenous person locally, answering the questions about Kamloops, about the residential schools, and people are just thriving to get the information about cultural sensitivity. And it's been really challenging to help along a process of decolonization and ways of thinking differently. I know that a lot of times we end up in systems like the Ministry of Children and Families, the Ministry of Social Development, housing systems. All of those systems require that colonial approach. So whenever we're working in those systems, it makes it really difficult to undo that. So the purpose of being here today was to just get some resource. And I think I've got a good basis of being able to share now with my colleagues. And I just want to thank you for sharing the information. And I hope that eventually we'll be able to connect again in the near future. And I just want to raise my hands to everyone for being curious and being thoughtful and taking the time today to learn more about our people as Indigenous people. My name is Hosteltanat, my traditional name. That means that my people are from the Fraser River people. That's where my name comes from. And my father's side is Vancouver Island, which means I'm from Sayout First Nation. And I've been in the social work field for a number of years and helping Indigenous people. A lot of times it's family. I say that I have well over 2,000 relatives from Nanaimo down to the USA. And yeah, so when they say that they can't connect with family, yeah, we've got very big families. And I was sharing a family tree recently, and we've got information in history that dates back to the 1800s, 1850 is the furthest we could go back. We couldn't go back any further because of the language. So yeah, we do have a lot of information to share. And yeah, thank you all for participating today. Thank you.
My relations. Thank you for those comments, Willa. We have very close people in our circle from your nation. So very, very close to the heart. Yeah. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Willa. I'm going to remove the spotlight because we have another question. And Josh, I believe your hand is up. So feel free to either put it in the chat or speak up. Thank you, Willa.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm half Asian, and I grew up right next to Reserve 9 on Galiano Island. And I went to school with many First Nations children. And we looked alike. We looked very similar, but we weren't very similar because of what you're explaining to me, the cultural differences I couldn't understand at the time. And I just think I've learned a lot today. And I just wanted to ask, when we talk about raising hands and people do this, am I allowed to do this, or is that something that you need permission? Because I think it's great to be able to do that, especially in this virtual world we're living in. And I'm just wondering, are we allowed to do that, or what is the real answer? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Josh. Thank you so much for that. And in just a moment, I'm going to call on our sister who just spoke as well to see if the teachings are different, because I think that you're going to be received differently in different communities. So the way that I've always been taught is that if an Indigenous person raises their hand to you, to reciprocate that is okay. For a non-Indigenous person to just pick up that practice, do you know what I might worry about is that I think that so much has been taken from Indigenous peoples that it might feel like appropriation. And so sometimes it's from one non-Indigenous person to another non-Indigenous person, is that appropriate? I'm going to ask you I would suggest that you err on the side of caution and say that could be perceived as appropriation. I don't want to do that. However, when an Indigenous person raises their hands to me, I've always been taught that that's an invitation for you to reciprocate. And I don't know if there's other teachings in the room. And I just realized that I put one of my sisters on the spot, and that was not my intention at all. But if there are other teachings, this is the benefit and the beautiful part about these forums is that facilitators are just that. They facilitate a discussion, but there's a lot of gifts that actually exists in the room that we're able to benefit from. But that was my teaching, Josh.
Thank you.
Very well said, Rochelle. It is, I would say, I would agree, it is appropriation. When somebody does that to you, you can do it back to them. As it is a sign of thank you, raise my hands up to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Joss, for that question and for, like having that vulnerability and that courage to say, I don't know. And I think that's the most important thing, is to be able to say, I don't know. Yeah. Tanya, is there any other hands up that I'm not seeing, or any other comments that are coming through? And if not, we'll start.
Actually, Jenny just opened her camera. So yeah,
okay.
We're inviting more.
All right. So Jenny, if you want to speak up, that's okay. And I will find you, and then I will spotlight
you. Thank you very much. I moved to BC from Ontario, Northern Ontario, and the tradition that I was taught was that if you're asking an elder for help, you offer them some tobacco. Is that the same tradition here? Like in our agency, we have recently reached out to the Lower Similkameen Indian Band, and we're asking an elder to come and give us some teachings here at our agency. Is it appropriate in BC to be offering him tobacco for him coming to our agency?
That's a really good question, Jenny. And what's interesting is that it's not about whether or not it's appropriate in British Columbia as much as is it Similkameen? Is it appropriate for Similkameen? Because every one of the nations will have different. Now, I happen to know that the Similkameen area does accept tobacco because I've worked with an elder who took me down to a lake. And when I asked, so I called the Okanagan Nation Alliance, because I had a relationship there. And so I asked her, I said, I'm doing some work with one of your elders. What's your protocol? And she told me tobacco. So okay. That's good just for the area. But if I were doing work with an elder, let's say in Prince George, I would probably call like the Friendship Center there. I might call one of the band offices and say, hey, do you have a cultural worker I can speak to? I have one quick question. And I would just say, working with an elder in your community, what's protocol? And they're usually really, really happy to give information, like really excited to give information.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for your question. And thank you, Rochelle, again, for just creating that generous space for people to ask. I will remove your spotlight, Jenny, so you're not on our spotlight. That can be a little bit like, I'm on camera. So I'm just looking at the time, and it doesn't seem like there's any other time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time and our speakers and our participants. And that is also saying that, yes, like what you were saying, each nation has different protocols as well. I've put in the evaluation link in the chat. I invite you again to just kind of give us some feedback, give Rochelle and Liz some love and some feedback as well, so that we can share this information. This recording will be available on our website for a short time. And then you also have the additional information in regards to the upcoming workshops, because you definitely don't want to miss those. And like I said, we're only accepting 35 people in each of those. So you definitely want to register as soon as possible. So again, Rochelle, Liz, gracias. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being part of this. Everyone that has attended, thank you for continuing on your learning, on your journey. And for those that shared, thank you for that courage. And may you all have a wonderful and safe day wherever you may be in this land where we all live. Rochelle, Liz, anything else from you?
Nothing at all. Miigwech, all my relations. Thank you, everybody. Till next time.
Till next time, for sure.